A paleontologist brushes dust from a curve of bone that should not be there. It rises from the back of a skull, narrow at first, then sweeping away in a long tube of stone. The jaw lies crushed below it. Teeth sit in rows where mud entered 75 million years ago. Around the fossil, the badland is dry and wind-cut, but the rock was once laid down beside water, where rivers moved across a warm coastal plain and carried leaves, branches, carcasses, and silt toward an inland sea. The crest is broken in places, yet enough remains to show that it was not solid. Inside it are passages. They begin at the nostrils, travel backward through the length of the crest, turn, and return toward the throat. The object in the rock is not only the outline of an animal. It is the remains of an instrument built into the skull of a dinosaur. No recording survives with it. There is no fossilized breath, no preserved vibration, no way to place a microphone beside the animal and hear what moved through those tubes. Sound disappears almost as soon as it is made. Bone can outlast a continent. A call cannot outlast a second. Yet the shape of the crest remains, and shape places limits on sound. A tube has a length. Air has mass. Walls reflect pressure waves. Chambers favor some frequencies and weaken others. From these simple facts, paleontologists and acousticians can begin to ask a question that once seemed impossible. What might Parasaurolophus have sounded like? And what would that sound have meant in the forests and floodplains of the late Cretaceous? This is not a search for a single dramatic roar. Parasaurolophus was a large herbivore, not a movie monster waiting to announce itself. Its voice, if the crest was used as most researchers suspect, belonged to ordinary life. It may have carried between animals moving through vegetation, helped adults and young remain in contact, marked the presence of a mature individual, or added sound to a visual display already impossible to ignore. The crest was part of breathing, part of appearance, and probably part of communication. If journeys into the dinosaur age are what bring you to Jurassical, subscribing keeps the next one close. Then the badland wind falls away, the stone becomes mud again, and the hollow crest returns to a living head. The animal standing at the edge of the trees is about 9 meters long. Its body is deep through the hips and chest, balanced by a tail stiffened with tendons. The forelimbs carry weight beneath the shoulders, while the hind limbs are longer and more powerful. Pebbled scales cover the flanks. The front of the mouth is broad and sheathed in a keratinous beak, useful for cropping stems and leaves. Behind that beak, hundreds of teeth are arranged in batteries, replacing one another as they wear. Parasaurolophus is a hadrosaurid, one of the duck-billed dinosaurs that became among the most successful large herbivores of the late Cretaceous. More specifically, it is a lambeosaurine, part of the hollow-crested branch of that family. Its famous tube is an extreme version of a structure that took many shapes in its relatives. The crest extends behind the skull like a long, backward-pointing pipe. In a large adult, it may approach the length of the rest of the skull, making the head seem drawn out into a form unlike that of any living animal. It is not a horn. It has no dense core designed to absorb impact. It is not a snorkel because there is no opening at its tip. It is not an air tank large enough to transform the animal into an underwater grazer. Early explanations often placed hadrosaurs in swamps and made their anatomy serve an aquatic life. But trackways, limbs, tails, and feeding machinery point to animals fully at home on land.
The crest still may have helped condition inhaled air or shed heat,
but its elongated passages and the hearing abilities inferred for hadrosaurs make acoustic communication one of the strongest explanations for its extraordinary form. The first recognized skeleton of Parasaurolophus was collected in 1920 from the Dinosaur Park Formation of Alberta. Levi Sternberg led the fieldwork, and William Parks described the animal 2 years later. The species was named Parasaurolophus walkeri. Its genus means something close to near Saurolophus, reflecting an early comparison with another crested hadrosaur, though the resemblance was more superficial than the name implied. Fossils are often named before their full significance is understood. A skull comes out of the ground incomplete. Bones are compared with what is already known. A place is found for the new animal, and only later do additional specimens reveal how unusual it truly was. Parasaurolophus began as a strange hadrosaur from Alberta. It became one of the clearest examples of how dinosaur anatomy may preserve evidence of behavior that no bone could record directly. 3 species are generally recognized from western North America. Parasaurolophus walkeri comes from Alberta and carries the long, relatively straight crest that defines the familiar image. Parasaurolophus tubicin, known from New Mexico, has an even more complex internal crest and a name that means trumpet player. Parasaurolophus certocristatus, also known from the American Southwest, bears a shorter and more strongly curved crest. These species did not all live in the same place or at precisely the same time. They occupied different regions along Laramidia, the western landmass formed when the western interior seaway divided North America. Their skulls preserve variation in crest size, curvature, and internal anatomy. If those differences affected resonance, then the genus may not have had one sound. It may have contained several related voices. A human listener would probably recognize the calls as low. That does not mean every sound was below the threshold of hearing or that the animal produced only a single note. Resonating structures shape a source sound into bands of energy. The length and branching of an airway can support several resonant frequencies at once. Early physical and digital models suggested tones ranging from deep audible frequencies into very low ranges, with Parasaurolophus tubicin producing especially low resonance because of its long and complicated passages. Later work has continued to test simplified tubes, scanned fossils, and mathematical models. None of these recreations can recover the exact living voice because the soft tissues that generated the original sound are unknown. They can, however, show what the preserved crest was capable of emphasizing. Imagine that capability in a forest where sight is limited. Conifer trunks stand between patches of broad-leaved flowering plants, ferns, and low vegetation. The ground is uneven, with roots, channels, and waterlogged hollows. A Parasaurolophus 50 meters away may be hidden entirely, yet a low call can bend around obstacles and carry through dense air more effectively than a thin, high note. The sound reaches the body as much as the ear. It arrives through the chest, through the ground underfoot, through the broad spaces between trees. Another animal lifts its head. The crest points behind it. Air moves out from the lungs, passes the vocal source somewhere in the throat or chest, and enters the long nasal route. The skull changes the breath into a signal shaped by bone. The signal ends, and the forest continues. Insects pulse from the vegetation. Water moves against a muddy bank. A pterosaur crosses above the canopy. Farther toward the seaway, wind presses through reeds and flowering shrubs. No single sound defines the Cretaceous, just as no single sound defines a modern wetland or forest. The title, Sound of the Cretaceous, does not belong to one voice alone. It belongs to an entire acoustic world that cannot be replayed, only approached through anatomy, sediment, living relatives, and physical law. Parasaurolophus gives us one of the best approaches because the organ that modified its calls was large, hollow, and made of bone. It survived long after the animal, long after the forest, and long after the air that once moved through it had vanished. To understand the crest, begin at the nostrils. In a living Parasaurolophus, they opened near the front of the broad snout, as they do in other hadrosaurs. From there, air did not take the short route directly toward the throat. The nasal passages climbed backward and upward, entering the bony crest. Inside, paired channels extended toward the far end of the tube, curved around, and returned toward the skull before joining the airway leading into the body. The exact arrangement differed among species and is difficult to reconstruct in fossils that have been compressed, cracked, or partly eroded. In Parasaurolophus tubicin, computed tomography revealed a network more intricate than the simple trombone-like loop once imagined. Even when the broad route is clear, thin internal partitions may be incomplete or displaced. Every acoustic reconstruction begins with anatomy, and every anatomical model must account for the damage done during burial and deep time. The crest was built largely from extensions of the nasal and premaxillary bones. These were ordinary skull elements, transformed by evolution into something extraordinary. As the animal grew, the bones lengthened and the passages within them extended. The crest was therefore not an ornament attached to the skull late in life. It was a reorganization of the face itself. In a juvenile discovered in Utah, the crest had already begun to rise when the skull was less than a quarter of adult size. The young animal did not possess the long adult tube, but the basic architecture was present early. This matters because a structure connected to breathing cannot simply appear when maturity is reached. It develops with the skull, changes with age, and likely changes the voice as it grows. A short passage resonates differently from a long one. Anyone who has blown across bottles of different sizes has heard the principle, though the anatomy of Parasaurolophus was far more complex than a bottle. Smaller juveniles probably produced higher resonances than adults. As the crest lengthened, the favored frequencies would have fallen. A herd, group, or temporary gathering of these animals may therefore have contained voices separated partly by age. Young individuals could have sounded different from mature ones, even if the soft tissue producing the initial vibration was similar. Adults might have recognized the calls of juveniles. Juveniles might have located larger animals by the deeper signals moving through vegetation. This is plausible rather than directly proven, but it follows from the preserved growth of the crest and the physics of resonating tubes. The source of the sound remains the largest missing piece. Mammals often produce voiced calls with tissues in the larynx. Birds usually generate sound lower in the respiratory tract with a syrinx, then shape it through the throat, mouth, and beak. Crocodilians use the larynx and can produce deep bellows, grunts, hisses, and vibrations that travel through air and water. Dinosaurs sit between birds and crocodilians on the evolutionary tree, but that does not mean every dinosaur used one modern system unchanged. The fossil record almost never preserves the delicate cartilages and membranes responsible for sound production. A fossil larynx from the Cretaceous ankylosaur Pinacosaurus shows that at least one non-avian dinosaur had a large and specialized vocal tract, but it cannot tell us the exact soft anatomy of Parasaurolophus. The safest reconstruction separates source from filter. Somewhere in the respiratory system, airflow set tissue or an air column vibrating. That initial sound then passed through the head. The long crest acted as a filter and resonator, amplifying some frequencies, weakening others, and perhaps giving each species a recognizable acoustic signature. The animal may have been able to alter the call by changing pressure, opening the mouth, adjusting the throat, or routing air differently through the nasal passages. Modern animals rarely produce only the one note predicted by the length of a tube. Muscles, membranes, valves, and behavior create variation. Parasaurolophus was likely no different. What the fossil preserves is not a finished song. It preserves the architecture that made a particular range of songs possible. In the early 1980s, paleontologist David Weishampel approached Lambeosaurian crests as acoustic structures and estimated their resonant properties from the lengths of the passages. His work helped move the discussion away from aquatic fantasies and toward communication. Later, a skull of Parasaurolophus tubicin from New Mexico was scanned in medical equipment. Hundreds of cross-sectional images revealed internal spaces hidden inside the fossil. Computer scientists and paleontologists converted those slices into a three-dimensional model, repaired distortion where possible, and treated the airway as a digital musical instrument. The result was often described as foghorn-like, low, sustained, and carrying. It was an experiment in possibility, not a recovered recording. The distinction is important. A model can calculate resonances accurately only if the geometry is accurate, and the geometry of a fossil skull has passed through many filters before it reaches a computer. The animal died. Soft tissues decayed. Sediment entered cavities. The skull was compressed by overlying layers. Minerals replaced or filled parts of the bone. Weather exposed the fossil, and excavation removed it from rock. Each stage can alter the shape that once guided air. Researchers must decide which cracks belong to anatomy and which belong to damage. They must estimate where cartilage, membranes, and fleshy walls narrowed or widened the passage. A convincing sound sample can make this uncertainty easy to forget because ears accept a voice more quickly than they accept a diagram. There is another problem. Resonance does not tell us how loudly Parasaurolophus called, how often, or in what emotional state. A long tube may support a powerful low tone, but the animal could have used it softly at close range. It may have produced short pulses, extended moans, repeated notes, or calls that rose and fell. Breathing rate, lung volume, posture, and muscle control would all matter. Even the position of the mouth could change the acoustic output. No bone says whether a call was an alarm, a greeting, a challenge, or a contact signal. Meaning exists in behavior, and behavior is the part of an extinct animal least likely to fossilize. Still, the crest did not evolve in isolation from behavior. It was expensive to grow, vulnerable to injury, and visually conspicuous. Natural selection tends to retain such structures when they affect survival or reproduction. A crest that helped individuals recognize members of their own species would be useful in ecosystems where several crested hadrosaurs lived near one another. A crest that made calls carry through forest or across open floodplain would help animals maintain contact. A crest whose size and shape changed with age could advertise maturity. These functions do not compete. The same structure can be a visual badge, an acoustic filter, and part of the respiratory passage at once, just as a bird's beak can gather food, regulate heat, shape sound, and contribute to display. The outside of the crest may have made the acoustic signal visible before it was heard. We do not know its color. No preserved pigment pattern has yet given Parasaurolophus a reliable palette. It could have matched the muted browns, grays, and greens often used in reconstructions, or it could have carried brighter markings. Living animals frequently place strong colors on structures used in social display, but fossil evidence is required before any specific pattern can be treated as more than art. What can be said is simpler. The crest transformed the silhouette of the animal. Seen between trees or against the pale sky above a riverbank, it would identify Parasaurolophus at a distance. Heard through the vegetation, the same anatomy may have identified it again. Beneath the remarkable head was a body built for moving through a productive landscape and processing large amounts of vegetation. Parasaurolophus shared the general proportions of other large hadrosaurids: powerful hind limbs, shorter but sturdy forelimbs, a deep torso, and a long tail reinforced by a lattice of ossified tendons. Those tendons reduced side-to-side flexibility and helped the tail act as a stable counterbalance. Older museum mounts sometimes placed duck-billed dinosaurs upright, dragging their tails like oversized lizards. Trackways and anatomy show a different posture. The backbone ran more nearly horizontal. The tail cleared the ground. The head extended forward, with the crest projecting behind it rather than pointing upward like a tower. The hands were not delicate grasping organs. The middle fingers were bound into a weight-bearing unit, probably enclosed in a fleshy pad, while the outer finger remained smaller and more mobile. On all fours, the animal could move steadily, with the head lowered into feeding height. On two legs, the forelimbs were freed, and the body could accelerate or reach higher vegetation. Parasaurolophus was facultatively bipedal. It did not need to choose one mode for life. Slow travel and browsing were probably often quadrupedal. Faster movement may have relied more heavily on the hind limbs. This flexibility was common among hadrosaurs and helped make them effective large herbivores across varied terrain. 5 metric tons is a reasonable estimate for a large individual, though body masses vary with the specimen and reconstruction. That is enough weight to leave deep impressions in wet ground, bend young trees, and make each crossing of a soft river margin physically obvious. Yet the feet spread that mass. The hind feet ended in broad toes with hoof-like nails and thick pads, distributing pressure across mud and sand. Trackways made by hadrosaur-like dinosaurs show animals capable of walking over floodplains without sinking as a narrow-footed animal of equal mass might. The sound of movement would have been lower and less explosive than cinema suggests. Repeated compressions of soil, the tearing of stems, water displaced around the feet, and breath moving through a large body. Fossilized skin impressions associated with Parasaurolophus and other hadrosaurs show a covering of small, non-overlapping scales, often described as pebbled. Larger scales could be arranged among smaller ones, creating regional patterns across the body. These impressions preserve texture, not the full thickness, color, or flexibility of the living skin. They do not tell us whether some areas carried soft display tissue, folds, or keratinous coverings. They do show that the animal was not wrapped in smooth reptilian leather. Light would catch a complex surface. Mud would lodge between scales. Parasites, scars, and old injuries would have marked individuals in ways that almost never reach the fossil record. The crest itself would have affected balance less than its size suggests, because much of it was airspace. A solid bone of the same dimensions would have added considerable weight behind the skull, demanding stronger neck muscles and altering movement. The hollow construction produced a large display surface and long acoustic pathway, without turning the head into an unbearable load. Bony struts and walls maintained shape around the passages. Muscles and ligaments attached around the skull and neck to support the head. A living Parasaurolophus could turn, lower, and raise the crest as part of ordinary posture. It was not a rigid ornament carried awkwardly above the body. It was integrated into an active animal. The eyes sat high on the sides of the skull, providing a broad field of view. A grazing or browsing herbivore benefits from seeing movement around much of the body, especially in habitats where predators can approach through vegetation. Depth perception directly ahead may have been more limited than in a forward-eyed hunter, but the animal did not need to judge the final leap onto prey. It needed early warning. A tyrannosaurid shape moving between trees, A disturbance in a group or the sudden flight of smaller animals could trigger attention before the predator came close. The head would rise, feeding would stop, the crest would lift with it, and the same structure visible above the foliage could become the path for an alarm call. Hearing was likely important. Studies of hadrosaur inner ears and middle ear anatomy suggest sensitivity compatible with vocal communication, including low frequencies. The exact hearing range of Parasaurolophus cannot be measured, but an elaborate resonator is most useful when other members of the species can detect the frequencies it emphasizes. Evolution does not need perfect matching, yet signals and sensory systems often shape one another. A call that travels but cannot be heard has little value. An ear sensitive to frequencies never used by the animal gains no social advantage. The crest, the airway, and the auditory system, therefore, belong in the same biological problem. Smell also mattered, though the long crest was not simply an enlarged smelling organ. The olfactory region lay closer to the brain, outside much of the extended loop. Air passing through the crest could still be warmed, humidified, or chemically sampled after returning toward the skull, but the dramatic length of the tube did not provide a matching expansion of olfactory tissue. This is one reason acoustic and display functions remain stronger explanations than enhanced smell. Parasaurolophus likely possessed a useful sense of odor like other large terrestrial animals. It could detect vegetation, water, carcasses, predators, and other members of its species. The crest was doing something additional. The neck was strong but not exceptionally long. Feeding height came from body posture and the ability to rear rather than from a sauropod-like reach. With the forelimbs on the ground, the beak could crop low plants and branches at roughly hip height. Rising onto the hind limbs opened higher brows, though the animal was not designed to remain upright for long periods. The broad snout suggests efficient cropping rather than delicate selection one leaf at a time. Once vegetation entered the mouth, the rear teeth processed it with repeated shearing and crushing movements. This feeding system supported the energy demands of a large, active dinosaur and freed Parasaurolophus from relying on only one plant type. Picture the animal after rain. Water beads on the scales and runs along the sides of the crest. The ground smells of wet leaves, resin, and disturbed mud. Each step presses a broad print into the floodplain. The body is not graceful because it is light. It is graceful because weight is controlled by joints, tendons, muscle, and practice repeated from youth. The head moves among branches. The beak closes on a spray of foliage. For several minutes, there is no call at all, only feeding. The most famous voice of the Cretaceous spends much of its life in silence. The mouth of Parasaurolophus was one of the most efficient plant processing systems ever evolved by a reptile. The broad beak gathered vegetation, but the beak did not do the difficult work alone. Farther back in the jaws, teeth were packed into vertical columns. Several replacement teeth waited beneath each active position. As the exposed crowns wore down, new ones moved into place, maintaining a continuous grinding surface. A large hadrosaur could carry hundreds of teeth at once, though only part of each battery was active at the biting surface. The arrangement turned individual teeth into a single functional unit, more like a file or millstone than a row of separate blades. Hadrosaur chewing was not identical to mammalian chewing. The lower jaw moved upward and backward, while slight movement between skull bones helped draw the tooth rows across one another. Wear facets show a combination of shearing and crushing. Tough stems could be sliced. Fibrous leaves could be broken and compressed. This was a major evolutionary advantage in the late Cretaceous, when flowering plants were spreading through many environments, but conifers, ferns, horsetails, and other older groups remained abundant. Parasaurolophus did not need to swallow branches whole and rely entirely on the gut. It reduced plant material before digestion, increasing the surface available to microbes and enzymes. Direct evidence for the exact menu is limited. Fossil teeth reveal where, not a complete list of species eaten. Coprolites and preserved gut contents from other hadrosaurs show that these dinosaurs could consume a mixture of leaves, twigs, bark, seeds, and decaying plant material. Some hadrosaur coprolites even contain traces of wood and crustacean shell, though whether small animals were eaten deliberately or swallowed with rotting vegetation is uncertain. Parasaurolophus probably fed broadly on plants available at reachable heights. The shape of its snout may indicate some selectivity compared with wider-muzzled relatives, but the animal was not confined to one favored plant. The Cretaceous forest around it was no longer the flowerless world of the Jurassic. Angiosperms had diversified and occupied river margins, disturbed ground, and parts of the understory. Their presence changed insect communities, soils, and the seasonal availability of leaves and seeds. Yet the canopy still included conifers, and ferns remained common in wet places. A Parasaurolophus, moving from the edge of a channel into drier woodland, crossed a mosaic of food. Young shoots grew where floods had stripped older vegetation away. Shrubs colonized sandbars. Fallen trees opened patches of light. Seasonal water levels shifted the boundary between marsh, forest, and exposed mud. Feeding made sound at close range. The beak cut stems with a dry snap. Teeth worked behind closed cheeks, producing pressure and friction rather than the open-mouthed tearing of a carnivore. Leaves brushed the face and crest. Branches flexed back after the animal passed. A group could be heard before it was seen, not because every member was calling, but because several large bodies were moving and eating at once. These ordinary noises formed the background against which a crest-amplified signal would stand out. A low call did not need to be constant. Its value came partly from contrast. The digestive tract occupied much of the deep torso. Large herbivores depend on microbial fermentation to break down cellulose and other resistant plant compounds. The longer food remains in a spacious gut, the more thoroughly microbes can extract energy from it. Body size, therefore, helped Parasaurolophus in another way. A large digestive chamber allowed slow processing of relatively low-quality food, while the dental battery prepared that food before it arrived. The animal's success came from the combination of intake, chewing, fermentation, replacement teeth, and movement across a varied landscape. The crest attracts attention, but most of the body was devoted to the daily economics of being a 5-ton herbivore. Those economics affected communication. Calling costs air and energy. Loud, repeated vocalization may also reveal location to predators. Animals do not produce signals without context. A Parasaurolophus feeding alone in dense cover may have remained quiet. A separated juvenile might call more often. Adults moving between patches could use intermittent contact notes. During courtship or competition, the cost of a powerful display might become worthwhile because the signal influenced access to mates or status. These possibilities are familiar from living animals, but the fossil record cannot assign them to specific calls. It can only show that the physical equipment was present. Seasonality would have changed both food and sound. During wetter months, channels spread across the floodplain and vegetation grew rapidly. Humid air and dense foliage affected how calls traveled. During drier intervals, water contracted into deeper channels and ponds. Animals gathered around remaining sources. Dust rose from exposed surfaces. Leaves hardened or fell. Competition increased where food and water were concentrated, and predators knew the same places. A low signal moving over open ground in the dry season would behave differently from the same signal inside wet forest. The acoustic world was not fixed. Weather, vegetation, topography, and distance reshaped every call. The animal also carried its own changing acoustic environment. Food in the mouth, the angle of the head, the amount of air in the lungs, and the condition of the nasal passages could alter the sound. An infection or injury might roughen a voice. A cracked crest wall could change resonance or weaken the structure. One famous Parasaurolophus walkeri specimen preserves unusual lesions near the neck and back, evidence that individuals experienced injury and disease like any living animal. Such pathology reminds us that the clean skeleton in a diagram is an average. Real dinosaurs had asymmetry, scars, pain, and imperfect anatomy. After feeding, Parasaurolophus lifts its head with plant fibers caught along the edge of the beak. The jaw stops moving. For a moment, the throat expands with breath. Air travels through the hidden root above the mouth, along passages no observer can see from outside. The crest does not announce its function by moving. It simply receives the airflow. A tone begins low, gathers strength, and passes between the trees. Then it fades, leaving only the animal, the leaves, and the work of eating enough to live through another day. The best-known northern species, Parasaurolophus walkeri, lived on a coastal plain in what is now southern Alberta. The modern landscape is carved into dry badlands, but the dinosaur park formation records rivers, ponds, swamps, forests, and low ground influenced by the nearby Western Interior Seaway. The sea lay to the east and advanced or retreated as sediment accumulated and coastlines shifted. Rivers descended from the rising mountains to the west, carrying sand, silt, wood, and volcanic ash. Their channels changed course repeatedly. A bend might cut into forest one century, fill with mud the next, and become a fossil bed after burial deepened. The climate was warm and seasonal, without the long frozen winters that define Alberta now. Wet periods brought floods. Drier periods lowered water levels and concentrated animals around channels. Conifers rose above a varied understory of ferns and flowering plants. The forest was neither a modern tropical jungle nor an open fern plain. It was a patchwork formed by disturbance. Mature woodland stood on stable ground. New vegetation covered point bars and levees. Swamps occupied low places. Storms opened gaps. Fire may have cleared some areas, while floods did the same work elsewhere. Parasaurolophus moved through a landscape constantly being rebuilt. It was not alone among hadrosaurs. Cretaceous carried a helmet-like hollow crest. Lambeosaurus bore a different cranial shape. Griposaurus and Parasaurolophus lacked the enclosed tubes of lambeosaurines, but had their own distinctive skulls. The coexistence of several large herbivores suggests that they divided resources by feeding height, habitat, plant choice, season, or geography. Their calls may also have needed to remain distinct. In a floodplain where more than one crested species could be heard, a recognizable acoustic signature would reduce confusion. The shape of each crest offered a built-in way to filter the voice differently. We should not imagine every species standing together in equal numbers. Parasaurolophus is relatively rare in the dinosaur park formation compared with some other hadrosaurs. That rarity may reflect genuine ecology, limited time in the area, preference for habitats less often preserved, migration through the coastal plain, or simple chance in the fossil record. Bones accumulate unevenly. Rivers collect some carcasses and destroy others. Upland animals are less likely to be buried than those living near sediment-rich channels. A rare fossil does not necessarily mean a rare living animal, but it warns against building enormous permanent herds without evidence. Ceratopsians moved through the same region. Centrosaurus, Styracosaurus, and Chasmosaurus carried horns and frills that made their own strong visual signals. Ankylosaurs, such as Euoplocephalus, crossed the floodplain behind low, armored heads. Small ornithopods ran through the understory. Theropods ranged from bird-sized hunters to tyrannosaurids. A single walk along an ancient channel could reveal body plans shaped by millions of years of display, defense, feeding, and competition. Crests, horns, frills, clubs, beaks, claws, and feathers occupied the same green world. The predators most relevant to an adult Parasaurolophus were Gorgosaurus and Daspletosaurus, large tyrannosaurids built for powerful bites. A healthy 5-ton hadrosaur was dangerous prey. It could run, kick, turn its mass, and use numbers if others were nearby. Predators would have preferred juveniles, injured animals, or individuals isolated by terrain. The first sign of danger may not have been the predator itself. It could have been smaller animals fleeing, a sudden silence in the vegetation, the smell of a carcass, or a movement glimpsed through trunks. Communication allowed one animal's detection to become information for others. An alarm call produced through the crest would need to be recognizable and urgent. But urgency does not always mean high pitch. Elephants communicate danger with low rumbles as well as louder trumpets. Crocodilians use deep calls in social contexts. Large birds combine low resonances with abrupt changes in rhythm. Parasaurolophus may have varied the duration, repetition, or intensity of its calls, rather than shifting to a completely different frequency range. A series of short pulses could convey a different state from a sustained note. The fossil cannot preserve that code, but living animals show how much information can be carried without changing the underlying instrument. Imagine a group feeding near a channel late in the day. One juvenile stands on firmer ground between adults. Beyond the trees, a tyrannosaurid approaches downwind. The predator places each foot carefully, but vegetation still moves. A Parasaurolophus turns its head. The broad visual field catches a vertical shape where no trunk should be moving. Feeding stops. A low call breaks from the crest, shorter than the contact notes used earlier. Heads rise across the group. The response is not panic at first. It is attention shared through sound. The group shifts toward open ground where the predator loses cover. Adults place their bodies between the threat and smaller animals, perhaps not through planned cooperation, but through the geometry of movement. The tyrannosaurid tests the edge, then slows. Most predator-prey encounters do not end in a kill. Hunting is expensive, and injury can be fatal. A warning signal that reduces surprise may protect prey without requiring combat. It may also tell a predator that concealment has failed. The call itself becomes part of the defensive system, as important in some moments as speed. When the threat passes, the soundscape returns in stages. Insects resume first. Water birds did not yet exist in their modern forms, but early birds and pterosaurs used the air above the channels. Frogs called from wet ground. Crocodilians surfaced with only eyes and nostrils visible. Leaves moved in the evening wind. Parasaurolophus lowers its head again. A contact note may pass between two animals at the edge of the group. Quieter now, the same hollow crest carrying reassurance instead of alarm. Low-frequency sound behaves differently from high-frequency sound. Longer wavelengths are less easily blocked by trunks and branches, and they lose less energy over distance under many conditions. That makes them useful for large animals separated by vegetation or spread across open ground. It does not make them immune to the environment. Temperature gradients bend sound. Wind carries it farther in one direction and weakens it in another. Soft ground absorbs some energy. Water surfaces reflect it. A call that travels a kilometer on a still evening may fade quickly during wind or heavy rain. Parasaurolophus lived inside these changing physical conditions, even if it understood them only through experience. At dawn, cool air could lie close to the floodplain beneath warmer air above. Such layers sometimes help low calls travel, especially across open terrain and water. By afternoon, rising heat and turbulent wind scatter sound. The animal did not need equations to respond. Individuals that called at effective times or from useful positions would be heard more reliably. A ridge, levee, or exposed riverbank might have served as an acoustic opening. Dense forest might have favored shorter distances and repeated signals. Behavior and landscape would shape one another. The crest may also have affected direction. A resonator connected to the nostrils could project part of the sound forward, while the mouth and throat radiated other components. Turning the head might change what another animal heard. The exact pattern cannot be reconstructed without the missing soft tissues, but the possibility adds another layer to display. A Parasaurolophus facing a rival or potential mate could present the crest visually and direct the call acoustically. The same signal would be weaker or altered from the side. Orientation may have mattered as much as distance. Modern listeners often imagine dinosaur calls as continuous background because films fill ancient landscapes with noise. Real ecosystems include long intervals of ordinary quiet. Animals conserve energy and avoid drawing attention. A forest can hold dozens of large vertebrates without every one of them vocalizing at once. The soundscape comes in bursts. A movement through brush, a contact call, the alarm of smaller animals, a splash, then stillness. Parasaurolophus probably contributed memorable low notes, but it did not spend the day performing for an audience. Rain changed everything. Drops struck leaves, water, skin, and exposed soil, creating broadband noise that masked distant signals. Rivers rose and carried branches against banks. Thunder rolled across the plain at frequencies that overlapped the deepest calls. During a storm, a Parasaurolophus might need to call more loudly, repeat more often, or remain close to others. After the rain, humid air and washed vegetation produced a different acoustic space. Small sounds returned sharply. Footsteps sank deeper. The crest dripped at its tip. The western interior seaway added a distant boundary to this world. In some places, the coast lay close enough for marine influence to reach rivers and swamps. Tides, storms, and shifting shorelines altered drainage. Salt-tolerant plants occupied low coastal ground. Beyond the land lived mosasaurs, sharks, fish, turtles, and diving birds, separated from Parasaurolophus by beaches, marshes, and estuaries. The dinosaur's call belonged to Laramidia, but the air carrying it moved above a sea that split a continent in two. Insects would have dominated many higher frequencies. Crickets and katydid-like orthopterans were present by the Cretaceous, along with beetles, flies, cicadas, and other groups. Their exact choruses cannot be reconstructed species by species, but the forest was not silent. Frogs and crocodilians added calls from wetlands. Birds had already diversified and likely produced a range of sounds, though not necessarily the familiar songs of modern woodland species. Parasaurolophus occupied the lower register of an already crowded acoustic environment. Low frequency is sometimes described as if the call must have been a single, pure note. A living resonator usually produces harmonics and irregularities. The complex passages of Parasaurolophus tubicen, in particular, would create peaks and valleys across a spectrum. Breath noise, tissue vibration, and changing pressure would add texture. The result may have been closer to a horn, bellow, or resonant moan than to a laboratory sine wave. Any modern reconstruction that sounds clean and musical is therefore only one controlled version of a messier biological reality. The animal's own body could feel the call. Strong, low frequencies produce vibration in the skull, throat, and chest. Bone conduction may have contributed to self-monitoring, helping Parasaurolophus regulate pitch or intensity. Other individuals at close range might detect vibration through the ground as well as through air, though direct evidence for seismic communication is lacking. A signal does not need to arrive through one pathway. Elephants listen with ears and feet. Crocodilians detect pressure and surface vibration. Parasaurolophus may also have experienced its voice as a whole-body event. Evening settles over the floodplain. Light leaves the understory before it leaves the sky. A distant animal calls from beyond a stand of conifers. The note is too low to reveal its exact source, but the crest of another Parasaurolophus turns toward it. No answer comes immediately. Then, breath enters the long internal loop, and a second call moves back through the trees. Between them lies water, mud, and vegetation. The animals do not need to see one another. The landscape is briefly connected by air. Social behavior is one of the easiest parts of dinosaur life to overstate. Bone beds of hadrosaurs, trackways made by several individuals, nesting colonies, and repeated associations of young animals show that many members of the group gathered at least some of the time. These gatherings may have been family groups, seasonal herds, age-segregated bands, or temporary concentrations around food and water. The evidence does not require every species to live in immense, permanent herds.
Parasaurolophus is known from relatively few specimens, and no single site preserves thousands of individuals moving together. It was probably social to some degree, because elaborate visual and acoustic signals are most useful when there are others to receive them. But the size and stability of its groups remain unknown. A crest can function as identity before it functions as attraction. Young animals need to recognize adults. Adults need to distinguish their own species from neighboring lambeosaurines. Individuals may benefit from recognizing familiar companions, rivals, or offspring. The shape of the crest provided a visual label, while its resonance could provide an acoustic one. In dense cover, sound may arrive first. In open ground, the silhouette may be enough. When both are available, they reinforce the same message. This is a Parasaurolophus of a certain size, age, and perhaps sex or condition. Sexual dimorphism has often been proposed for hadrosaur crests, but separating male from female in fossils is difficult. Crest size changes dramatically with growth, and incomplete specimens can make adults look like juveniles or different species. Earlier researchers suggested that the short-crested Parasaurolophus certocrestatus might be a female or immature form of a longer-crested species. Better skull material supports its recognition as a distinct species instead. This history shows why display hypotheses must be handled carefully. A crest may have played a role in courtship without every difference in crest shape being caused by sex. If males and females differed acoustically, the difference may have come from body size, soft tissue, or subtle internal proportions, rather than obvious crest length alone.
Modern animals often distinguish sex through pitch, rhythm, call structure, and behavior, even when their external anatomy overlaps. Parasaurolophus could have done the same. Fossils preserve the hard limits of the instrument, not the social rules governing its use. The absence of proven dimorphism does not remove courtship from consideration. It simply prevents us from assigning one crest form confidently to one sex. Display would have involved movement as well as sound. An animal could turn broadside, raise the head, angle the crest against the sky, or approach with a particular posture. The deep body and long tail created a large visual field around the head. Two adults meeting near a feeding area may have assessed one another before physical contact. A sustained low call could advertise size through the dimensions of the resonating tract, much as formants in modern animal calls can reveal body size. Honest signals reduce the need for dangerous fights. A smaller animal that hears and sees a larger rival can withdraw before teeth or feet are used. The crest itself was poorly suited to direct combat. Its thin walls and internal passages would be at risk if struck against another skull. This does not mean Parasaurolophus never fought. Large herbivores can push, bite, kick, shoulder, and chase without using their ornaments as weapons. The backward tube may have made close head-to-head impact especially hazardous, encouraging ritualized displays that kept animals apart. The more informative the signal, the less often a contest needed to become physical. A mature Parasaurolophus entering an open floodplain would be visible from far away. Sunlight catches the long crest first, then the back and tail emerge from vegetation. Another adult stands near the water. Both pause. One lowers the snout, draws breath, and produces a call that begins almost below conscious attention before strengthening into a broad, resonant tone. The listener turns. No words pass between them, yet the sound contains information shaped by age, body, anatomy, and intention. Juveniles would learn this social world gradually. Their shorter crests produced different resonance. Their bodies were smaller, their lungs held less air, and their calls likely lacked the power of adults. A young Parasaurolophus may have used repeated, higher contact notes when separated. Adults could answer with deeper sounds that traveled farther.
The exchange need not imply human-like parenting. It requires only that staying near larger animals improved survival, and that sound helped maintain proximity when vegetation blocked sight. Hadrosaur nesting sites from other genera show that these dinosaurs laid eggs in ground nests, and sometimes returned to favorable breeding areas. Young individuals could remain near nests for a time, though the details differed among species. No nest can yet be assigned securely to Parasaurolophus, with a preserved adult standing beside it. We therefore borrow only the broadest expectations from its relatives: eggs, hatchlings, rapid growth, and some level of social interaction. The crest's early development suggests that communication mattered before full maturity, even if the calls of hatchlings were produced mostly by soft tissues rather than a long resonating tube. Social life also includes spacing. A group feeding too tightly depletes vegetation and increases competition. Contact calls allow individuals to spread out while remaining coordinated. They can move along parallel routes through forest, converge at water, or follow a migration corridor without staying shoulder to shoulder. In this sense, the crest may have expanded the effective size of a group. Sound created a social space larger than sight alone could maintain. The same ability could separate species. Corythosaurus, Lambeosaurus, and Parasaurolophus had different crest geometries, and acoustic models suggest those differences would affect resonant frequencies. A juvenile might respond most strongly to the familiar frequency pattern of its own species. Adults in breeding condition might locate appropriate mates across distance.
Rival species could occupy the same floodplain without confusing every low call. Evolution did not need to invent a language. It needed only to make signals distinct enough for receivers to act correctly most of the time. At night, when the visual crest disappeared into darkness, the acoustic crest remained. Moonlight reflected from open water, but left the forest black beneath the canopy. A group rested on firmer ground above the channel. One animal shifted, branches moved, and a low note passed through the dark. Another answered. The call did not describe the night. It simply confirmed presence. For an animal surrounded by predators, mud, water, and trees, that may have been enough. The juvenile skull from Utah is one of the most valuable fossils for understanding how the instrument grew. The specimen, known as Ram 14,000 and nicknamed Joe, belonged to a young Parasaurolophus with a skull less than half a meter long. Its crest was only a low bump compared with the long tube of an adult, yet computed tomography showed that the nasal passages already occupied much of the developing structure. The bones were not merely preparing to support a crest someday. The airway had already begun its detour. Growth in Parasaurolophus was fast by the standards of many living reptiles. Hadrosaurs laid eggs, hatched small, and reached multi-ton adult sizes within years rather than centuries. Bone microstructure in related animals shows rapid deposition interrupted by slower seasonal growth. As the body lengthened, the skull changed proportion. The face grew. The crest extended backward. Internal tubes lengthened and altered their curves. Each stage changed what the animal looked like, and likely what frequencies its skull emphasized. A human voice drops during adolescence because the vocal tract and sound-producing tissues change. Parasaurolophus offers a different but comparable principle on a much larger anatomical scale. We cannot say it experienced a sudden vocal break or that its development matched mammals. The crest seems to have lengthened continuously. Still, the acoustic identity of an individual would have shifted as the passage grew. A group familiar with that animal may have heard age in its call long before maturity was reached. This gives the crest a biography. At hatching, there may have been little external sign of the future tube. In a juvenile, the rear of the skull began to rise. In a subadult, the crest extended farther and became more recognizable. In an adult, it formed the full backward sweep preserved in museum skulls. Old age might bring wear, injury, or changes in bone density. The structure was never static during life, even though a fossil fixes it at one moment. The juvenile also helps resolve species questions. Short crests can result from youth, while strongly curved crests can be genuine adult anatomy. Paleontologists compare sutures, bone proportions, surface texture, and internal organization to decide whether two specimens represent growth stages or separate species. This is why a single silhouette is not enough for taxonomy. The crest is visually dominant, but less obvious parts of the skull can preserve more reliable differences. Parasaurolophus certocristatus once suffered from this problem. Its type skull was incomplete, and its compact crest invited interpretation as a young or female version of Parasaurolophus tubicin. New cranial material from New Mexico revealed distinctive anatomy beyond simple crest length. The species could be diagnosed using the relationships of bones around the crest and skull roof, not only the outward curve. Better fossils turned what looked like a developmental stage into a regional species with its own evolutionary history. For the animal itself, none of these categories existed. A juvenile did not know it belonged to a species named by humans. It knew familiar shapes, smells, movements, and calls. It followed adults through channels and patches of vegetation. Its smaller feet left shallower tracks. Its shorter crest altered breath less dramatically. The sound of the group around it was lower than its own voice, a moving wall of signals from bodies still growing. Young animals faced the greatest danger. They lacked adult mass and speed, and their bones were more easily broken. Small tyrannosaurids, dromaeosaurids, crocodilians, and even large turtles near water could threaten hatchlings or juveniles. A contact call might reveal location, but silence could leave a separated animal unable to rejoin the group. Survival required balancing concealment with communication, a problem still faced by young birds and crocodilians. The crest may have allowed adults to call at frequencies less attractive or less informative to some predators, though there is no evidence that tyrannosaurids could not hear low sounds. Predators living in the same ecosystem likely used broad sensory ranges. Communication was not secret. Its advantage came from coordination, recognition, and distance, not invisibility. A call could help the group while also informing a hunter. Natural selection works through such compromises, rather than perfect solutions. Growth eventually shifted the balance. Each season added bone, muscle, and length to the crest. Teeth were replaced. The tail stiffened. The limbs thickened under increasing mass. A predator that once threatened the juvenile now faced an animal several tons heavier. The voice deepened with the body. What began as a small signal among vegetation became capable of crossing a floodplain. The adult skull in a museum and the juvenile skull in a laboratory are separated by size, place, and millions of years. Yet together they restore movement to development. One shows the long completed tube. The other shows its beginning. Between them lies an unwitnessed sequence of breaths, calls, seasons, injuries, and growth. The sound of Parasaurolophus was not one note held through life. It changed as the animal did. Parasaurolophus lived on Laramidia, a long, narrow continent bounded by the western interior seaway to the east and rising mountains to the west. At times, the habitable lowlands between those barriers may have been only a few hundred kilometers wide. Rivers ran generally eastward toward the sea. Climate varied from north to south, and mountain systems divided drainage basins. This geography created a chain of coastal plains where dinosaur populations could spread, become isolated, and meet again as environments shifted. The northern record gives us Parasaurolophus walkeri in Alberta. Farther south, rocks in Utah and New Mexico preserve Parasaurolophus certocristatus and Parasaurolophus tubicin. The formations are close enough in age to suggest evolutionary connection, but different enough in place and time to preserve regional histories. Paleontologists continue to debate how strongly dinosaur faunas were divided into northern and southern provinces. Some genera appear restricted. Others crossed broad ranges.
Parasaurolophus itself shows both patterns. A recognizable genus spread along Laramidia, expressed through distinct species. Parasaurolophus walkeri carried the long, nearly straight tube that slopes backward from the skull. The best-known specimen includes much of the skeleton, allowing the head to be placed on a body rather than studied alone. Its crest has become the standard image in books and museums, but it represents one species and a limited sample. We do not know the full range of variation within the living population. Mature individuals may have differed in crest length, curvature, thickness, or soft tissue covering without exceeding the boundaries of the species. Parasaurolophus tubicin took the structure farther. Its crest was long, and scans revealed multiple internal paths and chambers that made the airway more complex than expected. The species name, given in 1931, compares it to a trumpeter. That name captures the likely acoustic role, but can also mislead.
A trumpet uses vibrating lips and a flared bell. Parasaurolophus had neither in the same form. Its crest was a biological resonator connected to lungs, throat, nostrils, mouth, and soft tissues that remain uncertain. The complex tubes of Parasaurolophus tubicin could support several resonances. One short root may have emphasized extremely low frequencies, while longer or branching roots added higher components. Modeling has suggested a fundamental around 30 Hz for part of the system, near the lower edge of typical human hearing. But the precise value depends on reconstruction and assumptions. A living call would include more than a calculated fundamental. Some energy could lie above it, making the signal audible even when its deepest component was felt more than clearly heard. Parasaurolophus pseudocristatus presents a shorter, more curved crest. The shape may have produced higher resonant frequencies than the long tube of Parasaurolophus tubicin, though body size and internal anatomy also mattered. If the species lived in somewhat different habitats, its crest may have been tuned not only by ancestry and display, but by the acoustic conditions of those landscapes. Dense vegetation, open floodplain, humidity, and typical spacing between animals could all influence which signals traveled effectively. This remains an evolutionary possibility rather than a demonstrated adaptation. The Kaiparowitz Formation of southern Utah records a humid, river-rich floodplain with large channels, lakes, ponds, and wetlands. Mountains rose to the west. The inland sea lay to the east. Sediment accumulated to great thickness, preserving one of the richest records of late Cretaceous terrestrial life. Here, Parasaurolophus pseudocristatus shared the region with horned dinosaurs such as Cosmoceratops, Utaceratops, and Nasutoceratops, the hadrosaur Gripposaurus, armored dinosaurs, smaller theropods, and the tyrannosaurid Teratophonius. Farther south and slightly later in New Mexico, the Fruitland and Kirtland formations record coastal plains, swamps, forests, and channels near the retreating seaway. Parasaurolophus pseudocristatus is known from the Fruitland Formation, while Parasaurolophus tubicin comes from the Kirtland Formation. The succession captures environmental change through time. Shorelines moved, sediment sources shifted, plant communities and dinosaur populations turned over. The genus persisted while its species changed. A call made in Alberta did not travel to New Mexico. The distances were too large and populations were separated by geography and time. Yet the crest form and the behavior supporting it passed through generations across the continent. In that sense, the sound moved without any individual sound wave surviving. Anatomy carried the possibility southward. Each new animal rebuilt the instrument from growth, genetics, food, and bone. Population separation can change communication rapidly. Small differences in crest shape alter resonance.
Preferences for familiar calls can reinforce those differences.
Over many generations, visual and acoustic signals may help populations recognize their own kind and become reproductively isolated. Such processes are well documented in living animals, but they are difficult to prove in dinosaurs. Parasaurolophus, nevertheless, offers an anatomy in which signaling and species identity are physically linked. Its diversity may record not only geography, but the evolution of communication itself. Picture 3 skulls on a long table. The straight crest of Walkeri, the intricate tube of tubicin, the shorter curve of pseudocristatus. They are silent casts under museum light. In life, each would have shaped air differently. The differences are not separate from the animal's history. They are the history, written in bone as a set of related voices along the western edge of an inland sea. The southern floodplains were warmer and, in many places, wetter than the northern dinosaur park landscape. Rivers wandered across broad lowlands beneath a climate that supported dense vegetation and extensive wetlands. The Kaiparowitz system, in particular, accumulated sediment rapidly, burying logs, leaves, shells, bones, and entire channel deposits. The forest canopy included conifers and flowering trees. Palms and other warm climate plants grew in suitable areas. Vines, shrubs, ferns, and horsetails crowded disturbed ground. This was not one continuous swamp. It was a moving arrangement of levees, ponds, forests, peat-forming wetlands, and abandoned channels. A Parasaurolophus certocristatus walking there would encounter large-bodied herbivores with very different feeding equipment. Griposaurus used a broad beak and powerful dental batteries. Ceratopsians cut vegetation with deep skulls, hooked beaks, and shearing tooth rows. Ankylosaurs fed close to the ground. Coexistence was possible because the floodplain produced enormous amounts of plant material, and because species divided it by height, habitat, and preference. The acoustic environment was equally divided. Each large animal moved, fed, and signaled in its own way. Crocodilians occupied channels and ponds, including forms far larger than most living species. Turtles rested on banks. Fish moved through turbid water. Frogs called from wet vegetation. Small mammals remained close to cover, mostly beyond the notice of a 5-ton hadrosaur. A juvenile approaching water faced danger from below as well as from the forest. An adult could wade through shallows with less concern, but even large animals avoided deep, uncertain water when safer crossings were available. Teratophonius and other tyrannosaurids hunted these southern ecosystems. Their skulls were built for force, their senses for locating prey, and their hind limbs for moving efficiently across ground. A Parasaurolophus call might help maintain group awareness, but it also carried information to predators. Whether tyrannosaurids recognized individual call types is unknowable. They did not need to understand the social meaning. A low signal told them that a large animal was present somewhere in the landscape. Predation pressure does not silence a species with useful communication. It changes when and how signals are used. Calls may be less frequent when animals are alone, more common when visual contact is lost, and strongest when display outweighs concealment. A group near water may use quiet contact notes. A breeding adult may accept greater risk for a signal that travels farther. The same crest creates different consequences depending on context. Seasonal floods could isolate parts of the plain. Channels widened, old routes disappeared, and groups were forced onto higher ground. The noise of moving water masked calls near the river, but may have made low frequencies especially valuable at a distance. Across a flooded landscape, a Parasaurolophus standing on a natural levee could send a call over water toward animals visible only as dark forms among trees. During drier periods, wetland margins retreated and open mud developed around ponds. Footprints accumulated there: broad hadrosaur tracks, clawed theropod prints, turtle traces, and the marks of crocodilians entering water. Most were erased by the next flood. A few filled quickly with sediment and survived.
Trackways preserve movement without identity. A line of hadrosaur prints cannot usually be assigned to Parasaurolophus, but it shows how animals of its general build crossed the same surfaces that later buried bones. The Fruitland Formation of New Mexico developed close to the shoreline of the Western Interior Seaway. Coal layers formed where plant material accumulated in poorly drained wetlands. Sandstones mark channels and shoreline processes. Mudstones preserve quieter water and floodplain deposits.
Parasaurolophus pseudocristatus belongs to this shifting margin. Its fossils link a dinosaur famous for sound to rocks formed in an environment filled with water, vegetation, sediment, and constant change. Above it, the Kirtland Formation records a somewhat younger interval in the San Juan Basin. Parasaurolophus tubison lived there with pentaceratops, ankylosaurs, other hadrosaurs, small theropods, and tyrannosaurids. The exact ecosystem varied across the formation, but river and floodplain settings remained central. Here, the most elaborate known Parasaurolophus crest evolved or persisted, carrying its complex network of passages through the southern Cretaceous air. Why tubison became so acoustically intricate cannot be answered by one factor. The complexity may reflect inherited developmental changes, species recognition, sexual selection, habitat, or some combination. Evolution does not plan a perfect instrument from the beginning. Small changes accumulate when they do not prevent breathing and when they improve survival or reproduction. A slightly altered nasal wall changes resonance. A receiver responds. Over generations, anatomy and preference can move together. The southern species disappear from the rocks as layers rise toward younger time. There is no final preserved call, no last herd frozen in place. Fossils simply become absent. Rivers continue depositing sediment, while lineages change beyond the resolution of the record. The sound does not end in one dramatic moment. It fades because the animals carrying it are no longer there to rebuild the crest. For a crest to become evidence, an animal first had to die in the right place. Most Parasaurolophus bodies were dismantled by scavengers, weather, insects, microbes, and flowing water. Bones scattered across the surface. Sun cracked them. Roots pushed through them. Rivers rolled and broke them. The hollow crest was especially vulnerable. Thin internal walls could collapse before burial, and a skull lying exposed might lose the very anatomy that made the animal unusual. The fossils we have are survivors of a second selection imposed after death. A carcass entering a river could float for a time as gases accumulated. Limbs shifted. The skull separated from the neck. Teeth fell from their sockets. When the body grounded on a sandbar or sank into quieter water, sediment began to cover it. Rapid burial protected bone from scavenging and surface weathering, but the process was rarely gentle. Floods rearranged skeletons. Channels cut through older deposits. Mud entered open cavities, including the nasal passages that once carried air. Imagine the crest filling from within. Silt moves through the nostril opening and settles in the long tube. Water replaces breath. Fine particles pack against delicate walls. The animal's last call is already gone, but the root that shaped it becomes a mold of sediment. Over time, mineral-rich groundwater moves through bone and mud. Organic material decays. Pores fill. The skull changes from a biological structure into part of the rock. Pressure increases as more sediment accumulates overhead. Bone may flatten, shear, or crack. A straight crest bends slightly. A chamber narrows. The left and right sides shift out of alignment. Millions of years later, these distortions can resemble natural anatomy. Paleontologists must compare both sides of the skull, use related species, trace fracture lines, and digitally reverse compression where possible. Reconstructing the acoustic pathway is therefore also an exercise in geology.
Erosion eventually brings the fossil back toward the surface. Uplift raises old sediments. Wind, rain, frost, and running water remove the overlying rock, grain by grain.
A piece of bone appears on a slope. It may be discovered quickly or destroyed in a few seasons. Fieldwork begins with fragments: a tooth, a rib, the edge of a skull, a line of bone weathering from sandstone. The paleontologist follows the material into the hill, not yet knowing whether the crest is present.
The 1920 Alberta specimen was collected in an era when dinosaur expeditions used picks, shovels, plaster, horses, boats, and long seasons in remote badlands. Fossils were mapped and jacketed, but the internal anatomy of a skull remained largely inaccessible without cutting it open. William Parks could describe the outer crest and the bones visible around breaks, yet the complete hidden root had to be inferred. Early interpretations were constrained not only by scientific ideas, but by technology. Parasaurolophus tubicin changed that story because one skull preserved enough internal detail for modern imaging. Medical computed tomography sends X-rays through an object from many angles and reconstructs slices based on density. Fossil bone, sediment, mineral fill, and empty space can sometimes be separated digitally. Researchers trace the airway across hundreds of images, connect the outlines, and build a three-dimensional volume. A structure inaccessible inside a heavy skull becomes something that can be rotated, measured, copied, and tested. CT scanning does not remove judgment. Fossil and matrix can share similar densities. Cracks produce misleading gaps. Thin walls may fall below scan resolution. Digital segmentation requires a person to decide where one material ends and another begins. The final airway model can look precise because computer surfaces are clean, but its precision reflects both data and interpretation. Good reconstructions preserve uncertainty instead of hiding it. Physical replicas add another step. A digital passage can be printed, cast, or represented with pipes. Air or sound is driven through it, microphones record the response, and mathematical predictions are compared with measured resonance. A fossil skull becomes a virtual cavity, then a physical object, then a spectrum on a screen. Across that chain, a Cretaceous anatomy enters a modern laboratory without the original bone being damaged. In 2024, a simplified physical model nicknamed the linophone was used to test mathematical approaches to Parasaurolophus resonance. The device was not a full reconstruction of a living head. It used connected tubes inspired by the crest, suspended and excited with a speaker, while a microphone measured frequencies. Its value lay in checking the behavior of the model and preparing methods that could later use more detailed fossil geometry. The work continued a long tradition. Each generation builds a better instrument from the same incomplete stone evidence. The most famous reconstructed calls can create the impression that the problem has been solved. It has not. We know much more securely that the crest could resonate than we know the exact sound produced through it. We can estimate favored frequencies. We can compare species and growth stages. We can test how tubes respond. The living source, soft walls, muscles, air pressure, call rhythm, and behavior remain beyond direct recovery. That uncertainty does not make the work less meaningful. A scientific reconstruction is not valuable because it removes every unknown. It is valuable because it narrows possibility. The crest could not have produced any sound imaginable. Its length and chambers constrained the voice. The skull in the rock tells us where speculation must stop and where evidence can begin. Reconstructing any dinosaur sound begins with living archosaurs. Birds and crocodilians are the closest living branches surrounding non-avian dinosaurs. Both communicate acoustically, but they generate and shape sound in different ways. Crocodilians bellow with a laryngeal source and can vibrate the water around them. Birds usually produce sound with a syrinx at the base of the trachea,
then modify it through the upper airway. Parasaurolophus may have resembled aspects of one system, both, or neither in detail.
The evolutionary bracket establishes reasonable possibilities, not a recording template. Modern crocodilian bellows show how large reptiles can produce low, information-rich calls.
Resonances in the vocal tract reveal body size. Rhythms and amplitude change with context. Young crocodilians use higher distress calls that attract adults. These behaviors make age-graded communication in Parasaurolophus plausible, especially when its crest length changed so dramatically during growth. Yet crocodilians lack a comparable bony nasal tube, so their sound cannot simply be slowed down and assigned to a hadrosaur. Birds demonstrate the opposite lesson. Complex sound can come from anatomy that leaves little fossil trace. A songbird's syrinx, membranes, air sacs, tongue, beak, and learned behavior combine to create calls far richer than the bones alone would predict. Large birds such as cassowaries, emus, cranes, and bitterns produce low booms, drumming notes, or resonant calls using extended airways and inflatable tissues. These analogies show what soft anatomy can do, but no living bird carries a Parasaurolophus crest. The fossil larynx of Pinacosaurus, described in 2023, adds a rare piece of direct evidence. Its bony elements suggest a large, mobile structure that may have modified sound in a bird-like way, though the vocal source remains uncertain. Pinacosaurus was an armored dinosaur, not a hadrosaur, and lived in a different branch of the dinosaur tree. The discovery does not solve Parasaurolophus vocalization. It does show that the throat anatomy of non-avian dinosaurs could be specialized, and that simple reptilian grunts should not be treated as the only option. Sound production evolves quickly because communication depends on both sender and receiver. A small change in a membrane alters pitch. A longer airway changes resonance. A population that responds to a particular call can drive the anatomy producing it. The long crest of Parasaurolophus may therefore represent a history of feedback between skull growth and social behavior. Bone records the sender's filter. Inner ear anatomy offers a partial view of the receiver. The missing link is the behavior connecting them. The hearing system of hadrosaurs included a relatively long cochlear region compared with many reptiles, suggesting sensitivity across useful vocal frequencies. The middle ear likely transmitted airborne sound through a tympanic membrane and slender stapes. Details vary among specimens, and soft components are reconstructed from attachment areas and living relatives. Still, the general picture supports an animal capable of hearing more than ground vibration or very low rumbles. Parasaurolophus could likely detect the harmonics and changes that made calls distinct. Predators heard this world too. Tyrannosaurid inner ears and brain cases indicate well-developed sensory systems, including hearing and smell. A low call traveling through forest may have reached a hunter beyond visual range. That risk creates pressure for signals to be useful, timed, and perhaps directional. It may also explain why some calls were quiet or restricted to close social interactions. A resonator increases efficiency. It does not require constant volume. There is no reason to expect only nasal calls. Parasaurolophus could probably hiss, exhale sharply, clap the beak, rustle vegetation, or produce unresonated sounds through the mouth and throat. The crest may have dominated long-distance communication, while other noises served close range. A newborn with almost no crest still needed ways to signal. A feeding adult with the mouth full might use breath or body movement. The animal's acoustic repertoire was likely broader than the fossil tube alone. Foot stomps and tail movement also generated vibration. The reinforced tail was not a whip like that of Diplodocus, but it could strike vegetation or the ground during rapid turns.
Several animals moving together created low-frequency noise independent of vocalization. An approaching group may have been detected first as a tremor of footsteps, then as broken branches, and only later as individual forms. A call from within that movement would be one layer in a larger physical presence. Our ears are poor time machines. We want a recognizable sound, something that can be played once and labeled Parasaurolophus. The evidence offers a range instead. Low resonance, species-specific variation, changing pitch with growth, and a probable role in communication. It offers structure without performance. The rest must remain careful imagination, guided by living animals and kept within the walls of the crest. Before sunrise, mist lies over a channel cut into the floodplain. The water is dark, reflecting only the lightest part of the eastern sky. A group of Parasaurolophus stands on a wooded levee above the bank. Their bodies are close enough to share warmth from the still air, but not pressed together. Some rest with the neck lowered. Others remain upright, listening. The long crests are almost invisible until one animal turns and the outline crosses the pale horizon. The first movement comes from a juvenile. It steps between two adults, disturbing wet leaves. A higher call passes through its shorter crest, brief and uneven. An adult answers with a deeper note that builds slowly, holds, then falls away. The exchange is not a conversation in the human sense. It confirms distance and direction. Around them, frogs and insects continue. A crocodilian slides from mud into water without a splash large enough to draw attention. As daylight reaches the understory, feeding begins. The animals spread along the levee where fresh growth follows an earlier flood. Beaks crop leaves and tender stems. The jaws work continuously. One adult pulls down a branch by raising its head and stepping backward, then strips the foliage before releasing it. The branch springs upward, shaking water across the crest and shoulders. Hadrosaur feeding was repetitive and efficient. A large animal needed to process vegetation for many hours, and the dental batteries allowed it to do so without waiting for worn teeth to be replaced. The group is not arranged as a perfect herd. Two adults move closer to the channel. Several younger animals remain among thicker vegetation. Another individual feeds alone 30 meters away, visible only when its crest passes between trunks. Contact is maintained through occasional low calls and the constant noise of movement. No leader gives commands. Direction emerges as animals respond to food, water, one another, and the first signs of danger. By mid-morning, heat begins to rise from open sand. The group leaves the levee and follows a path trampled through ferns toward a broader floodplain. Their feet find firmer ground where repeated crossings have compressed the soil. A line of prints remains behind, some overlapping, some filled with water. Most will be erased. One may survive if a thin layer of silt covers it before drying, and later floods bury the surface beyond reach of erosion. The open area changes the use of the crest. Animals that were hidden among trees are now visible across hundreds of meters. A mature Parasaurolophus pauses with the head raised, presenting the full length of the tube against the sky. Another adult stands farther away, near a patch of shrubs. The first call travels without trunks to break it. Its lowest component spreads close to the ground, while higher harmonics make the source easier to locate. The distant animal answers, and the group continues. Whether the exchange marks recognition, spacing, or simple contact cannot be known. The effect is clear.
Both individuals remain aware of one another as the distance changes. A juvenile turns toward the reply, then returns to the adults beside it. Communication does not need symbolic meaning to organize movement. A signal can influence direction, speed, and attention without describing anything beyond the caller's presence and state. Near noon, the floodplain becomes quieter. Insects remain active, but large animals seek shade or water.
Parasaurolophus rests beneath conifers where the soil is dry enough to support its weight. The crest lies almost parallel to the back when the head lowers. Breathing continues through the internal route, even without vocalization. Air is drawn from the nostrils, carried through the long passages, and returned toward the throat. The resistance created by that route must have been manageable during normal activity, which means soft tissues and passage diameters were integrated with the animal's respiratory needs. A sudden movement breaks the rest. Several small dinosaurs run from cover. Heads rise across the group. One adult turns toward the western tree line, but no predator appears. After a minute, the animals relax. False alarms are part of survival. Responding too often wastes energy. Responding too late ends a life. Social animals reduce that uncertainty by watching one another. A single alert posture spreads before any call is made. The afternoon journey follows higher ground between channels. Vegetation grows denser and the group stretches into separate clusters. Low calls return because sight is restricted. Some notes are short, others last several seconds. The deepest call comes from a large adult near the rear, where two juveniles have slowed to feed. It travels forward through the line. Several heads turn, but the leading animals do not stop. The message may be no more complicated than location, yet location is enough to keep the group from breaking apart. By evening, they reach a pond fed by an abandoned channel. Turtles slip from logs. Fish disturb the surface near shore. The largest Parasaurolophus enters first, testing the bottom with each step. Water rises over the feet and lower legs, but remains shallow. The others spread along the margin. They drink with the head low and the crest extending behind, vulnerable to any animal approaching from the rear. Several adults remain upright while others drink. The sun falls behind the western uplands. Calls become less frequent as the group settles on firm ground above the pond. One note crosses the water and returns as a faint reflection from the opposite bank. For a moment, the crest makes the entire basin part of the signal. Then the echo disappears. Darkness closes over the prints, the feeding paths, and the bodies resting among trees. Another day in the Cretaceous ends without leaving a skeleton, only marks that almost certainly will not last. Morning does not always return quietly. A group moving between feeding areas can be watched for hours by a predator that never reveals itself. Tyrannosaurids were not simple pursuit machines. Their large olfactory regions suggest a strong sense of smell, while their eyes, ears, and experience helped them choose vulnerable prey. A healthy adult Parasaurolophus offered a great amount of food, but also great risk. One kick from a powerful hind limb or a fall beneath several tons of struggling animal could injure a hunter beyond recovery. The safest target is young, sick, trapped, or separated. A river crossing creates all four possibilities. Mud slows movement. Water hides the bottom. Adults spread across the channel instead of forming a compact group. Noise masks the approach of another animal. A tyrannosaurid waiting in vegetation near the exit does not need to outrun the herd across open ground. It needs only one moment of confusion. The first Parasaurolophus reaches the far bank and climbs. Others follow. A juvenile loses footing where the mud has been churned by larger feet. It regains balance, but the delay opens distance.
An adult behind it gives a short, forceful call. Heads turn on the bank. The juvenile moves again. The call may be alarm, contact, or both. Behavioral categories that humans separate can overlap in a single, urgent signal. The predator appears from cover with its body angled toward the smaller animal. The group surges forward. Adults shift around the juvenile, not as soldiers following a plan, but because each responds to the same threat and to the movement of neighbors. The ground transmits the impact of feet. Water erupts behind them. Calls become shorter and louder. The long crests remain attached to heads moving at speed, demonstrating that the structure was strong enough for the sudden forces of running, even if it was not built for impact. The tyrannosaurid closes part of the distance, then abandons the attempt as the ground firms and adults accelerate. No kill follows. The predator slows, mouth open, breathing hard. Parasaurolophus continues until vegetation and distance create safety. One animal calls repeatedly from the rear. Others answer at intervals. The group reforms over several minutes, each individual locating the movement of those ahead. Running placed different demands on the respiratory system than resting or feeding. Airflow increased. The long nasal route added resistance, yet Parasaurolophus could not simply stop breathing through the crest whenever it moved quickly. Soft tissues may have allowed some bypass through the mouth or adjusted flow between passages. Open-mouth breathing is common in active living reptiles and birds. The exact solution is unknown, but the animal's survival proves that the crest did not prevent effective exertion. Injuries accumulated over a lifetime. A fall could fracture ribs. A predator bite might heal into scarred bone. Infection could spread around a wound. Arthritis could stiffen joints. Parasaurolophus fossils preserve some pathological changes, including unusual growth and damage along the back and neck of the type specimen. Interpreting cause is difficult because bone reacts similarly to different injuries. What matters is that the animal lived long enough for healing to occur. A damaged crest would pose special problems. Cracks could open the nasal passage to infection or alter resonance. Broken tips might heal if blood supply reached the bone, but thin walls could remain vulnerable. We have little direct evidence for crest trauma in Parasaurolophus. Perhaps behavior kept the structure away from impact, or perhaps damaged crests were less likely to preserve. A voice changed by injury would still belong to the individual, possibly making it more recognizable to companions. Recognition does not require a human concept of identity. Many birds, mammals, and reptiles distinguish familiar calls. If Parasaurolophus did the same, small differences caused by anatomy, age, or injury could matter. The crest provided a shared species pattern, while the rest of the vocal tract added individual variation. A group might hear both the kind of animal calling and which animal it was. Predation also shaped silence. After an attack, calls may stop while animals move away. The group relies on sight and close spacing until distance increases. Only later does a low-contact note pass through the trees. It receives an answer from ahead, then another from the side. The calls do not celebrate escape. They rebuild the pattern of presence that danger disrupted. The tyrannosaurid returns to the crossing after the herd is gone. It smells the mud, follows tracks for a short distance, and stops. The floodplain contains many possible meals and many failures. Behind it, water begins to soften the prints. Within days, the entire episode is erased. No fossil records the chase. The only evidence that such moments occurred lies in the anatomy of predator and prey, in healed wounds, and in the communication systems that made survival more likely. The outside of the crest must have mattered as much as the hidden tubes. It enlarged the profile of the head without adding the mass of a solid horn. From the side, it drew a line backward over the neck. From the front, it appeared much narrower. An animal could therefore change the apparent size of the display simply by turning. Broadside, the crest was obvious. Head-on, the body and gaze became more important. Soft tissue may have changed that outline. Blood vessels, skin, keratin, or a modest fleshy ridge could have covered parts of the bone. The fossil surface provides clues about attachments, but no specimen preserves the complete living exterior. Reconstructions that add sails or large membranes go beyond current evidence. A close skin covering is safer, perhaps with slight thickening around the base and tip. Even a thin layer could carry color and alter the surface reflection. Color remains one of the great temptations. A display structure seems to invite bright patterns, especially when modern birds, reptiles, and mammals use contrasting colors around the head. Yet, Parasaurolophus pigment has not been recovered.
Browns, greens, reds, yellows, stripes, and patches are all possible at a general level, but none is established for the genus.
Scientific restraint does not require imagining the animal gray. It requires separating plausible color from known color.
Visual and acoustic signals often work together because each has different strengths. Color and posture are precise at close range and in daylight. Low calls travel around obstacles and continue after dark. A crest that served both channels would remain useful across changing conditions. In open country, an adult could display silently. In dense forest, it could call without being seen. During courtship, movement, color, and sound may have been combined into a sequence impossible to reconstruct from bone alone. The internal passages also constrained external shape. Evolution could not alter the crest freely without affecting breathing and resonance. A larger visual display lengthened the tube. A change that improved species recognition might also lower the acoustic frequencies. This coupling makes Parasaurolophus especially interesting. In many animals, a feather crest and a vocal tract can evolve somewhat independently. Here, the ornament and the resonator were the same growing bones. Such coupling can accelerate diversity. A population begins with a slightly different curve. Receivers prefer the new outline or sound. The trait spreads. Development changes to produce it more reliably. Over time, descendants become recognizably different in both appearance and voice. The three species of Parasaurolophus may preserve stages of this process across geography and time, though the fossil sample is too small to reconstruct every transition. The crest also revealed condition. An adult that had grown well could support a large, complete tube. Malnutrition or disease during development might reduce size or produce asymmetry. Damage would be visible. Calls would expose changes hidden inside. A potential mate or rival did not need to inspect the animal closely. The signal carried the consequences of growth in its shape and resonance. Honest signals are not perfectly honest because animals are moral. They are honest when physics makes deception difficult. A small body cannot easily produce the same resonant pattern as a much larger airway. A damaged crest cannot hide every acoustic effect. Parasaurolophus may still have controlled volume, duration, and posture, but it could not freely choose the dimensions of its skull during a contest. At close range, the calls may have been less dramatic than their anatomy suggests. A low resonator can enrich a quiet sound as well as a loud one.
Adults standing a few meters apart could exchange soft nasal tones, grunts, or breaths that barely traveled beyond the group. The crest's fame comes from its potential for long-distance calls, but social life is often built from quieter signals. Two animals feed beside the same stand of shrubs. One steps too close. The other raises its head and turns the crest broadside. A short, low note follows, not loud enough to cross the floodplain. The first animal shifts away. No chase, collision, or injury occurs. The structure has done its work through a small adjustment of distance. Parasaurolophus has carried nearly as many imagined functions as it carried meters of crest. Early 20th century paleontology inherited the idea that duck-billed dinosaurs were semi-aquatic animals, spending much of their lives in lakes and swamps. Their broad snouts were compared with ducks, their limbs were misread as swimming adaptations, and their tails were reconstructed as paddles. The crest was forced into that picture. It became a snorkel, an air reservoir, a device for keeping water out of the lungs, or a structure that helped support the head while swimming. Each proposal could be tested against anatomy. A snorkel needs an opening at the far end, and the crest has none. An air tank must hold enough useful volume to justify its cost, but the narrow passages offer little reserve for a multi-ton animal.
A valve for underwater feeding must fit the rest of the skull and behavior. Yet hadrosaur teeth, trackways, limbs, and tail structure point to terrestrial feeding and locomotion. The ideas faded not because they sounded strange, but because the evidence failed to support them. Other explanations moved on to land. The crest was proposed as a weapon, a foliage deflector, a support for neck muscles, a salt gland, or a cooling device. Some functions can be rejected strongly. Thin, hollow walls make a battering weapon unlikely. The attachment points do not support a giant ligament running from crest tip to back. The olfactory tissues were not expanded through the long tube. Thermoregulation is harder to exclude completely because blood vessels and moving air can exchange heat, but the anatomy does not require heat control as the primary reason for the crest's extreme length. The resonance hypothesis survived because it fits several independent observations. The passages are long and enclosed. Crest shape differs among species. Crest size changes with age. Hadrosaur hearing appears compatible with social calls. Elaborate visual structures are common in animals that also use acoustic display. No single observation proves the exact behavior, but together they form a stronger explanation than any one-purpose aquatic device. Science often advances this way. A fossil does not announce its function. Researchers propose mechanisms, compare them with anatomy, and discard those that cannot survive testing. New specimens reopen questions. New technology reveals hidden structures. The most accepted explanation remains provisional, not because all ideas are equally likely, but because evidence can always improve. The name Parasaurolophus tubicin shows how early researchers already sensed the acoustic possibility. Carl Wyman described the species in 1931 and noted the similarity between its nasal system and the resonating anatomy of some living animals. Later work by James Hobson emphasized display and species recognition. David Weishaupt brought acoustic calculations to the crest. Computed tomography and digital modeling then made the internal geometry more accessible. The modern picture is cumulative. No single experiment created it. Popular culture simplified the result into a dinosaur trombone. The image is useful because it communicates a long air column and low tone. It is inaccurate if taken literally. Parasaurolophus did not have a brass bell, valves, a human player's lips, or a fixed musical scale. The crest was connected to living tissue
and a moving body. Its output would vary with pressure, posture, growth, and behavior. A cinema roar usually combines sounds from lions, elephants, crocodilians, camels, whales, and mechanical effects. Such mixtures are designed for emotion, not paleobiology. Parasaurolophus is often given a mournful horn because the crest suggests one, and that may approach the general low register. The emotional quality belongs to human ears. A call we interpret as sad could have been routine contact. A sound we interpret as threatening could have been courtship. Meaning cannot be recovered from timbre alone. Museum exhibits sometimes let visitors hear a reconstructed call beside a skull. The experience is powerful because sound fills the empty space around bone. It reminds the listener that the skeleton once breathed. Yet, the best exhibits explain the assumptions behind the audio: airway reconstruction, resonance calculation, and estimated soft tissue. A responsible reconstruction invites wonder without disguising uncertainty. The history of the crest is therefore also a history of changing imagination. First, it belonged to a swamp animal breathing underwater. Then it became a visual ornament, a horn, a cooling surface, and finally, a resonator studied with scanners and computers. The fossil did not change. The questions did. Each generation heard something different in the same silent tube. A resonator does not create energy. It redistributes it. Air leaving the lungs carries pressure changes produced by vibrating tissue or turbulent flow.
When those changes enter a tube, waves travel along the passage, reflect from boundaries, and interfere with one another. At certain frequencies, the reflections reinforce the incoming wave. At others, they cancel part of it. The reinforced bands are resonances, and they give a voice much of its recognizable character. The simplest open or closed pipe can be described with basic equations linking length, sound speed, and wavelength. The crest of Parasaurolophus was not simple. It curved, narrowed, widened, branched, and joined other spaces in the skull. Soft tissue would have changed the effective length and boundary conditions. This is why a single calculation can provide an estimate, but not a complete voice. Detailed models treat the passage as a connected acoustic system rather than one straight tube. A frequency around 30 Hz has a wavelength of more than 10 meters in air. Such a wave is long enough to bend around trunks and low obstacles with little loss from diffraction. Humans can hear 30 Hz under good conditions, but sensitivity is poor there. The sound may be experienced as vibration or pressure rather than a clearly pitched note. Harmonics above it would make the call more audible and help locate the source. Different sections of the crest could reinforce different bands at the same time. A long main loop might support the deepest resonance. Shorter side paths could add higher peaks. The mouth cavity and throat could introduce more formants. The result would be a spectral pattern, not one isolated frequency. Two species with similar fundamental notes might still sound distinct because the spacing and strength of their higher resonances differed. The caller could also modify the spectrum. Increasing lung pressure raises amplitude and may change how tissues vibrate. Opening the mouth introduces another radiation path. Moving the tongue or throat changes cavity shape. A valve directing more air through one passage than another could alter resonance. No fossil proves that Parasaurolophus possessed all these controls, but living archosaurs use comparable adjustments. The animal was not a passive pipe attached to lungs. Acoustic models often begin with an impulse or broadband signal so that every frequency enters the system at once. The output reveals which frequencies are favored.
A living call would begin with a narrower source. If the source lacked energy near one resonance, the crest could not amplify what was not there. Source and filter must overlap. The final voice depends on both. Room acoustics provide a familiar comparison. A clap in a small furnished room dies quickly. The same clap in a cathedral becomes a long reverberation because the space supports reflections. The clap has not changed, but the environment reshapes it. The crest of Parasaurolophus was a cathedral built into the face, though much smaller and more controlled, with walls grown from bone and a path repeated in every breath. Scale matters. A model printed at 1/3 size does not produce the same frequencies as the full animal unless the results are scaled mathematically. Shorter tubes resonate higher. Material also matters less for air column resonance than geometry, but flexible living walls could absorb or shift energy differently from rigid plastic. Researchers therefore use physical models to test principles and digital models to explore the actual fossil dimensions. The atmosphere of the late Cretaceous had broadly similar acoustic properties to today's air, despite differences in climate and greenhouse gases. Sound speed depended mainly on temperature, and warm air carried waves slightly faster than cool air. Humidity reduced some high-frequency absorption. These effects change details, not the basic conclusion. A long crest still favors low frequencies, whether the day is hot, humid, cool, or dry. Terrain can create secondary echoes and interference. A call near water reflects from the surface. A cliff or cut bank sends it back with delay. Dense foliage scatters higher harmonics. The animal hearing the call receives a version shaped first by the crest and then by the world.
Every signal is therefore a collaboration between anatomy and landscape. A Parasaurolophus born in one valley would grow familiar with how calls behaved there. It might learn, through simple, repeated experience, where companions could be heard and where channels or trees blocked them. No abstract understanding is required. Animals alter calling position and timing in modern habitats. The same behavioral flexibility was available to dinosaurs with sufficiently developed senses and social lives. In a digital model, the call appears as lines on a graph, frequency on one axis, intensity on another. In life, it moved through leaves, water, skin, and bone. The graph is not less real. It is the measurable shadow of an event the fossil can no longer perform. By reading that shadow, science brings the crest closer to sound without pretending the distance has vanished. The strongest case for the crest is not that one behavior explains every detail. It is that several related behaviors benefit from the same anatomy. Species recognition, age signaling, long-distance contact, courtship, rivalry, and alarm all use communication. A long, hollow crest can serve each without being redesigned. The meaning changes, while the physical filter remains. Species recognition is supported by the distinct crest shapes of lambeosaurines and by the likelihood that those shapes produced different resonant patterns. In ecosystems containing several crested hadrosaurs, visual and acoustic differences would help prevent costly mistakes. This does not require calls to function like names. A receiver only needs to respond more strongly to familiar signals from its own species. Age signaling is supported by ontogeny. Juveniles had shorter crests, and shorter passages favor higher resonances. The link between growth and sound follows physical law even when the exact call is unknown. Whether adults changed their behavior in response to juvenile frequencies remains inferential, but age-related acoustic differences are among the most secure predictions available from the fossils.
Long-distance contact is supported by low-frequency resonance and the probable sociality of hadrosaurs. Animals moving through forest, floodplain, or seasonal migration routes benefit from signals that travel beyond sight. The crest could make such calls more efficient, allowing a given amount of airflow to produce stronger energy in useful bands. Efficiency matters when large animals call repeatedly across a day. Courtship and rivalry are supported more indirectly. The crest was conspicuous, changed with maturity, and varied between species. These are common traits of display structures. A resonant call could advertise body size and condition, while the visible crest reinforced the message. Yet no fossil preserves mating behavior, and no proven male-female crest difference lets us assign specific displays to sex. Alarm calling is plausible because social herbivores often warn or coordinate after detecting predators. A low signal can travel, and changes in rhythm or intensity can convey urgency. The weakness is that the crest's form does not specifically identify an alarm function. The same anatomy could carry any call. Alarm should therefore be treated as one likely use within a broader repertoire, not the reason the crest evolved alone. Thermoregulation may have been a secondary benefit. Air moving through a vascularized passage exchanges heat and moisture. A long cavity provides surface area. The extent of blood supply and soft tissue lining is not fully known, and other hadrosaurs breathed effectively without such extreme crests. Cooling or warming may have occurred without explaining why Parasaurolophus evolved its particular shape. Olfaction is less convincing as a primary driver because the sensory tissue associated with smell did not fill the extended crest. Air passed through the system, but more tube did not necessarily mean more smell. Aquatic uses fail more clearly because the crest lacks a terminal opening, and the rest of the skeleton belongs to a terrestrial herbivore. Support for neck ligaments or combat conflicts with attachment anatomy and structural weakness. Ranking hypotheses is more useful than choosing between certainty and ignorance.
Science can say that resonance is strongly supported. Visual display is strongly plausible. Species and age recognition fit multiple lines of evidence. Thermoregulation may have contributed, and snorkel or weapon functions are poor explanations. The result is a layered picture rather than one final label. A living crest did not care which category a researcher would later prefer. It warmed inhaled air, altered pressure, changed the silhouette, and resonated whenever sound passed through it. Biological structures are rarely limited to one function. Feathers insulate, display, sense air, and enable flight. Antlers signal, fight, and reveal condition. The Parasaurolophus crest belongs to the same world of multifunctional anatomy. Consider an adult calling during a breeding season. The sound travels to potential mates, rivals, juveniles, and predators at once. It advertises species, size, location, and state, whether or not the animal intends every effect. A second adult answers. The exchange influences movement across the floodplain. One approaches, another withdraws. Young animals remain near the group. A predator changes direction toward the sound. One call becomes many kinds of information because different listeners use it differently. The fossil record preserves the structure at the center of that network, but not the listener's responses. This is why reconstructions should remain specific about evidence and open about behavior. The crest can tell us what air did inside bone. It cannot tell us every decision made after the sound reached another animal. In a museum gallery, Parasaurolophus often stands with the crest level and the body stretched behind it. Visitors notice the head first.
The skeleton seems to point toward the tube, as though every rib, vertebra, and limb exists mainly to carry that one feature. Yet the mounted bones are incomplete in a different way from the fossil in the field. Missing elements have been mirrored or cast. Metal supports hold the posture. The skin, lungs, muscles, air sacs, throat, and behavior are absent. Silence surrounds an animal reconstructed from parts. A skull displayed alone can be more revealing. The broad beak widens at the front. The eye socket sits behind it. Teeth form dense batteries along the jaws. The crest extends farther than expected, and broken areas reveal walls thinner than its size suggests. Viewed from the side, the structure looks simple. Viewed in scan slices, it becomes a folded root through the face. The public silhouette and the scientific anatomy are two different encounters with the same fossil. Preparation begins long before display. Technicians remove matrix under microscopes, stabilize cracks with adhesive, and build supports around fragile surfaces. Every decision balances access with preservation. Removing all sediment from inside the crest might destroy partitions or erase evidence of original fill. Leaving it in place makes visual inspection impossible. Imaging allows researchers to look through the matrix without opening the skull, preserving both the fossil and a record for future methods. Digital models can be copied without handling the original. One researcher measures passage length, another estimates volume. An acoustician creates a mesh suitable for simulation. A museum prints a replica for visitors to touch. A paleoartist uses the external surface to rebuild skin and posture. The same dataset moves between anatomy, engineering, education, and art. Each use asks a different question, and each must remember where the digital surface is certain and where it was reconstructed. A scan also lets scientists undo damage virtually. One side of a crushed skull can guide restoration of the other. Fragments can be moved back into alignment. Missing gaps can be bridged using related specimens. The restored model is not the fossil as found, and it may not be the exact skull in life. It is a hypothesis made visible. Good digital restoration keeps the original and reconstructed versions separate, so that later researchers can test the choices. Acoustic simulation then converts geometry into behavior of air. The model is assigned openings, wall properties, and a sound source. Pressure waves are sent through it. Software calculates where energy concentrates and how it exits. The result can be displayed as frequencies or rendered into audio. Changing one assumption can change the sound. A narrower throat, softer wall, different source position, or open mouth may alter resonance. Therefore, the most informative result is often not one dramatic file, but a range showing which features remain stable across models. The stable result is low resonance. Exact notes vary, but the long crest consistently favors deep frequencies. Species and growth stage should alter those frequencies. Complex passages should produce several resonant bands. Across decades of increasingly detailed work, the central idea has survived. Parasaurolophus carried a wind instrument in its skull, though the player and performance are still missing.
Visitors sometimes lean close to the display, as if the bone might answer. A speaker can play a reconstruction, and the gallery briefly fills with a low tone. Children feel it in the floor. Adults look again at the crest and understand that the cavity had purpose. This emotional response is not evidence, but it can lead back to evidence. Wonder becomes a reason to ask how the sound was made, what is known, and what remains uncertain. Museums are full of silent structures that once shaped noise. The hollow bones of birds supported breathing during calls.
The skulls of crocodilians enclosed resonating throats. Mammoth jaws carried vibrations through living heads. A fossil gallery is not a naturally quiet place. It is a place where sound-producing bodies have lost the tissues and air required to perform. Parasaurolophus stands apart because so much of its signal filter was made of bone. Most voices vanish almost completely. Here, the vocal tract extended into a fossilizable ornament. Deep time preserved an unusual fraction of the acoustic system. It is still incomplete, but it is far more than paleontologists receive from most dinosaurs. When the gallery closes, the lights dim over the skull. Air from the building's ventilation passes around the crest, but not through its sealed internal route. The fossil remains silent through the night. Its only sound comes when someone returns with a scan, a model, and enough care to let physics speak for it. Parasaurolophus lived during the Campanian stage of the late Cretaceous, roughly between 77 and 73 million years ago. That places it well before the asteroid impact at the end of the period. Tyrannosaurus had not yet appeared in its final form. Triceratops did not yet stand on the plains. The famous last communities of the Mesozoic belonged to a future several million years away. Parasaurolophus occupied an earlier Cretaceous world, one defined by the western interior seaway and a different set of hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, ankylosaurs, and tyrannosaurids. 4 million years is a short interval on a geological chart and an immense duration in biological life. If one generation averaged a decade, hundreds of thousands of generations could pass. Rivers changed course countless times. Shorelines moved. Species appeared, spread, and disappeared. The genus we name as one unit contained populations living too far apart in time to meet, even when their fossils sit beside one another in a museum drawer. The crest evolved before any human ear could imagine it, and vanished without leaving descendants that retained the same structure. Later Lambeosaurines carried other elaborate crests, and hadrosaurs remained important herbivores until the end of the Cretaceous. Parasaurolophus itself dropped from the record. We do not know the cause. Environmental change, competition, geographic isolation, ordinary species turnover, and the rise of descendant or neighboring lineages could all contribute. No catastrophe has been identified as its singular end. This matters because extinction is often imagined as one final crisis. Most species disappear more quietly. Reproduction falls below replacement. Habitat shifts. Small populations become isolated. A lineage changes enough that paleontologists give its descendants another name, or it simply leaves no descendants at all. The last Parasaurolophus did not know it was last. It breathed through the crest, fed, moved, and called within a world that seemed complete. The western interior seaway continued to change after the genus vanished. Mountain building altered river systems. Coastal plains migrated eastward and westward. New dinosaur communities replaced old ones. Hadrosaurs evolved different skulls and signals. The Cretaceous soundscape continued without the long tube, just as a modern forest continues after one species disappears. No direct evolutionary line connects the Parasaurolophus crest to a living bird's voice. Birds are dinosaurs, but they descend from small feathered theropods, not hadrosaurs. The calls outside a window today are distant evidence that dinosaur acoustic communication survived in another branch, not that the Parasaurolophus instrument became birdsong. Its lineage ended. The broader dinosaur capacity for sound did not.
Living birds still demonstrate principles that help interpret the fossil.
Air sacs support breathing. Vocal tracts filter sound. Calls identify species, age, sex, individual, and emotional state. Young animals learn when to answer and when to remain quiet. Crocodilians preserve other archosaur patterns of low-frequency communication, parental responses, and body size cues. These comparisons are tools, not replacements. They define biological possibilities around a structure no living animal shares.
The absence of a modern equivalent is part of what makes Parasaurolophus difficult. A giraffe helps us imagine a long-necked browser. An elephant helps with large herbivore movement and low-frequency calls. A crane or crocodilian helps with resonance and social signaling. A trumpet helps explain an air column. None combines the full anatomy. Every analogy must be assembled from separate pieces and then checked against the fossil. A reconstructed Cretaceous landscape has the same problem. Modern floodplains provide channels, levees, forests, insects, frogs, crocodilians, and seasonal floods. The plant species differ. The dinosaur communities differ. The inland sea has vanished. Climate and geography have changed. The ancient world can be approached through familiar processes, but the final combination existed only once. Sound makes that uniqueness especially clear. We can rebuild the shape of a leaf from an impression and the stride of an animal from tracks. We can estimate the color of a feather when microscopic pigment structures survive. A call leaves no such direct imprint. The best evidence is indirect. The apparatus, the ear, the environment, and the behavior of relatives. This is why certainty must stop before the voice becomes too specific. Parasaurolophus almost certainly produced sound. The crest almost certainly modified resonance. Low frequencies are strongly predicted. Differences with age and species are expected. A precise melody, emotional tone, call sequence, or volume cannot be recovered. The honest reconstruction ends with a range, not a soundtrack. Yet a range is enough to transform the animal. Parasaurolophus is no longer only a skeleton with a decorative tube. It becomes a listener and a caller, an animal moving through spaces larger than sight. Its world has distance again. The forest can hide bodies without separating them completely. The floodplain can carry identity through air. Return to the riverbank at the end of a dry season. The channel has narrowed, exposing wide shelves of mud marked by feet, tails, claws, and sliding shells. A mature Parasaurolophus stands where the water is still deep enough to drink. Its skin is dusty along the back and dark with moisture around the legs. The crest extends behind the skull in a clean line, catching the last light above the trees. Farther across the plain, another animal is hidden by vegetation. The first raises its head. The throat and chest prepare a breath. Air enters the long internal root that began growing when the animal was small. A low call passes over the water, through the shrubs, and into the distance. The answer arrives several seconds later. Nothing about the exchange needs to be dramatic. The animals may be separated members of the same group, adults maintaining space, or individuals gathering near water before night. The exact meaning is unavailable, but the physical event is not beyond imagination. Lungs move air. Soft tissue generates vibration. The crest reinforces selected frequencies. Ears receive the signal. A head turns. One body changes direction because another body called. For a brief interval, anatomy becomes behavior. The caller lowers its head and drinks again. Ripples reach the bank. A turtle moves from a log. Small insects gather over the water. Beyond the channel,
A hadrosaur steps through reeds, and the vegetation closes behind it. The Cretaceous does not pause to preserve the moment. Sound dissipates into heat. Footprints soften. Leaves fall over tracks. The river continues carrying sediment toward the inland sea. Days later, a flood may rise from storms in the western highlands. It crosses the mudflat, strips vegetation from the bank, and lays down a new layer of silt. Some prints fill before their edges collapse. Most disappear completely. The animals move to higher ground and return when the water falls.
Layer after layer accumulates, recording storms more readily than calls and channels more readily than social lives. The world becomes geology without knowing that anything has been lost. When paleontologists arrive tens of millions of years later, they do not find the evening, the reply, or the reason one animal turned. They find a skull fragment, a tooth battery, a crest wall, or a skeleton incomplete at the tail. The evidence is physical and limited. It can reveal size, age, growth, injury, feeding, posture, and the path of air. It cannot reveal every behavior. The task is to build the narrowest bridge possible between what remains and what once happened. That bridge begins with description. Each bone is measured, sutures are traced, the rock layer is mapped. Associated fossils establish the environment. Microscopes reveal wear. Scans expose hidden chambers. Models test resonance. Comparisons with birds and crocodilians define possible soft tissues. Every step reduces some uncertainty and introduces another assumption that must be stated. The process is slower than imagination, but it gives imagination a shape it could not reach alone. The sound of Parasaurolophus emerges from this process as a probability rather than a performance. It was likely low, resonant, and variable. Adults probably differed from juveniles. Species probably differed from one another. Calls may have traveled through forest and across floodplain, helping animals remain connected when sight failed. Visual display and acoustic identity likely worked together. Beyond those points, confidence decreases. The exact voice remains on the far side of the fossil record. There is value in leaving it there. A complete invented soundtrack would close the question too neatly. The silence around the fossil preserves room for new evidence. Another skull with less distortion, a better juvenile series, more detailed ear anatomy, a rare throat element, or a model that handles soft tissue more realistically. Future work may move the likely frequencies, reveal new passages, or show that some familiar reconstructions are wrong. The crest has already changed meaning several times in the history of paleontology. It may do so again. What remains stable is the image of air traveling through bone. The nostrils open at the front of the beak. The passage extends backward farther than any ordinary nose, climbs into the crest, turns at the end, and returns toward the skull. Breath crosses a distance built by growth and evolution. The animal carries that distance with every step. Even when no call is made, the possibility of sound is present inside the head. A juvenile carries only the beginning of it. Its calls are higher, its body lighter, its tracks smaller. Season by season, the tube lengthens. The voice shifts downward. The crest becomes visible above vegetation and recognizable across open ground. By adulthood, the structure identifies the animal twice, once to the eye and once to the ear. The fossilized growth series allows us to follow that transformation without hearing a single note. An injured adult carries a different version. A healed lesion along the neck changes posture. A damaged passage may alter resonance. Age thickens some bones and wears others. The
The call no longer matches the clean output of a laboratory tube. It belongs to one body, marked by one life. Such individual variation is almost entirely absent from popular images, yet it is part of every living population. A species carries another version. Parasaurolophus walkeri shapes air through a long northern crest. Parasaurolophus certocristatus uses a shorter, curved structure in southern floodplains. Parasaurolophus tubicin adds complexity within the tube. Their calls overlap in ancestry, but diverge in anatomy. Across Laramidia, different populations build related instruments from the same basic skull bones, each generation restoring a voice that exists only while animals breathe.
The ecosystem carries the rest. Conifers and flowering plants change how sound moves. Humidity and temperature alter its speed and loss. Water reflects it. Wind bends it. Other animals mask or answer it. The call of Parasaurolophus is never isolated in life, even if a modern reconstruction plays it alone through a speaker. It belongs among feeding sounds, footfalls, insects, frogs, crocodilians, birds, pterosaurs, storms, and rivers. At dawn, the lowest notes may travel beneath cool air pooled over the floodplain. By afternoon, heat and wind break the path into shifting pockets of audibility. In the wet season, leaves and running water fill the middle and higher frequencies. In the dry season, open ground allows a call to cross farther before trees interrupt it. A receiver hears not only the caller, but distance, direction, weather, and terrain mixed into the signal. The same individual can sound close beside a channel and remote across a wooded levee, even when the physical distance is unchanged. Communication is therefore never produced by the crest alone. It is completed by the place through which the pressure wave travels. This is the deeper difficulty in asking what a dinosaur sounded like. A voice is not only an acoustic object, it is an event in a place, produced for listeners under conditions that change from minute to minute. Recovering a frequency is not the same as recovering the moment. The crest gives science unusual access to the first problem. The rocks and associated fossils help with the second. The complete event remains unreachable. Yet the attempt brings the Cretaceous closer in a disciplined way. We can stand beside a scanned skull and follow the airway with a cursor. We can measure the tube, print a model, send sound through it, and compare the output with equations. We can walk the modern badlands where the bones were found and read river channels in cliffs. Each action replaces a vague dinosaur noise with a set of testable constraints. The result is quieter than a film and more interesting. Parasaurolophus was not defined by a roar. Its probable voice served ordinary needs repeated over thousands of days, keeping contact, displaying maturity, recognizing species, warning companions, locating young, or negotiating distance. The crest mattered because those ordinary needs shaped survival and reproduction. Evolution turned communication into architecture. In time, the individual at the riverbank will die. The group will move without it. Its calls will stop immediately, while the body remains for days or weeks. Scavengers open the carcass. Water shifts the bones. The skull settles where mud can enter the nostrils. Sediment fills the long route that air once traveled. The instrument is silenced and preserved by the same process. The lower jaw may separate first. Teeth loosen and scatter into the channel. Ribs turn in the current while the heavier skull catches against a branch or bank. If burial is slow, the crest breaks and the internal walls disappear. If a flood covers it quickly, those walls survive beneath silt, though pressure will later crush and distort them. Chance decides whether the animal becomes a complete skeleton, an isolated skull, a few weathered fragments, or nothing recognizable at all.
The fossil record favors no individual because its call was beautiful or important. It preserves what sediment reaches before decay and erosion finish their work. Millions of years pass above it. The seaway withdraws. Mountains rise. Rivers cut through younger rock. Mammals diversify. Grasslands spread. Ice advances and retreats. Humans arrive in North America and eventually begin naming the layers beneath their feet. The crest waits through all of it, not as memory, but as mineralized anatomy. A field worker finally sees bone in the slope. Brushes clear the surface. Plaster protects it. The skull travels to a laboratory where the sediment-filled tube is scanned without being opened. On a screen, the passage appears slice by slice. The route can be followed again from nostril to crest tip and back. Air no longer moves through it, but geometry survives.
That geometry is enough to place a low voice in the late Cretaceous with reasonable confidence. It is not enough to hear the individual. The difference should remain visible. Science can recover the instrument more securely than the music. It can describe the hall more securely than the performance. It can show why the call was deep without knowing what the call meant on one evening beside one river. Even the best model should therefore be heard as one member of a family of possible sounds. A slightly different throat, nostril opening, air pressure, or crest wall produces another result while remaining consistent with the same fossil. Several reconstructions may all be biologically plausible, and none can claim the authority of a recording. What matters is the shared structure across them. Low energy strengthened by the tube, resonant peaks shaped by internal length, and variation expected with growth and species. The voice is bounded without being fixed. That distinction is easy to lose when audio is presented beside a lifelike animation. Image and sound together create confidence, even when both contain choices. A responsible reconstruction should therefore show alternatives where they matter. Mouth open or closed, one soft tissue arrangement or another, a call driven gently or under greater pressure. Listeners may prefer one version, but preference does not make it more accurate. The evidence is strongest where the alternatives converge. They all pass through an unusually long nasal system. They all acquire deep resonances from the crest. They all change when the tube is shortened for a juvenile or reshaped for another species. Around those shared results, the living animal retains freedom that stone cannot remove. The skull now rests under controlled light. Dust is kept away. Temperature and humidity are monitored. A label gives the species, formation, and age. Visitors pass beneath the crest and see the long curve before they notice the teeth. Some imagine a horn. Others remember a sound played in a documentary. The fossil offers neither confirmation nor denial. It offers the passage itself. Behind the public display are field notes, photographs, scan files, measurements, and repaired fractures that record how the specimen reached this form. A child may hear the reconstructed tone and look for an opening at the crest tip. An adult may notice that the tube returns toward the throat instead. A researcher may see a boundary in the scan that deserves to be traced again. The same skull can support wonder, correction, and new work without changing position in the case. Its silence is not emptiness. It is the condition that requires every claim about sound to pass through anatomy before reaching the imagination. At the end of the day, the gallery empties. The lights lower. The crest casts a narrow shadow across the wall. Inside the fossil, the ancient airway is filled with stone or sealed by preparation, unable to resonate. Still, its shape holds the limits of a vanished call. Somewhere between the measurements, the models, and the remaining uncertainty,
the Cretaceous becomes audible for a moment. The moment does not need to be louder. It ends where it began, with a curve of bone emerging from rock and a question carried through its hollow center. No sound remains in the skull, only the path the sound once took.